The barricade appeared overnight, concrete blocks sealing off Maple Ridge Road like a fortress wall. Sarah Chen stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug trembling in her hands as she watched the HOA president's smug smile through the chain link. Fenced 23 years she'd lived here. 23 years of refusing to bow to their tyrannical demands. Now they'd done the unthinkable, trapped her on her own property like a prisoner. But what the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association didn't know was that Sarah Chen was a retired civil engineer who'd built half the infrastructure in this county, and she'd buried a secret in these hills that would bring their perfect little Sarah Chen had always known this day would come. She'd felt it building like storm pressure in her bones, seen it in the increasingly venomous glares from her neighbors, heard it in the carefully worded threats disguised as community improvement notices. But knowing and experiencing were two different creatures entirely. The morning sun cast long shadows across what had once been Maple Ridge Road, now transformed into something resembling a military checkpoint. Concrete barriers formed an impenetrable wall 20 feet from her property line, topped with gleaming razor wire that caught the light like silver teeth. A sign hung from the central barrier, Private Road, Nitrogen Monoxide Trespassing Willowbrook Heights, HOA, Authority. Sarah's fingers tightened around her coffee mug as she watched Richard Pemberton emerge from his pristine BMW, his $1,000 suit immaculate despite the morning's construction chaos. The HOA president moved with the calculated precision of a man who'd never faced real consequence, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. 23 years, Sarah whispered to herself, her breath fogging the kitchen window. 23 years of this. The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. She recognized the number, Pemberton's personal line. Ms. Chen, his voice, oozed false concern through the receiver. "I trust you've seen our morning's work. Quite impressive, don't you think?" The construction crew finished ahead of schedule. "What you've done is illegal, Richard. This is a public road." His laugh was like nails on chalkboard. "Oh, my dear woman, I'm afraid you're quite mistaken. According to the county records we had updated last month, Maple Ridge Road is now classified as a private thoroughfare, maintained exclusively by the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, which, as you've so stubbornly insisted for over 2 decades, you are not a member of." Sarah's knuckles went white around the phone. "You can't just change public records because you feel like it. You'd be surprised what a few well-placed donations and some strategic friendships can accomplish." Mayor Davidson was quite understanding when we explained the situation, as was County Commissioner Walsh. They agreed that a private community should have the right to control access to their private roads. Through the window, Sarah watched Pemberton wave at her, his gesture mockingly cheerful. Behind him, other HOA board members gathered like vultures in expensive clothing, Margaret Foster clutching her designer handbag, Dr. Harrison Webb adjusting his golf visor, and Janet Mills scribbling notes on her ever-present clipboard. "You're making a mistake," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. "A very big mistake. The only mistake here was made 23 years ago when you refused to join our community association. We've been patient, Miss Chen. We've offered you numerous opportunities to become a contributing member of our neighborhood. You've chosen to remain an outsider. How shall I put this? A problematic element?" Sarah's mind raced back to those early days when she'd first bought the property. The modest ranch house sat on 2 acres of pristine land, surrounded by towering oaks and a creek that sang through the seasons. She'd been recently divorced, starting fresh after her husband's betrayal, and the peace of the place had called to her like a siren song. The Willowbrook Heights development had been just a handful of houses then, built around the original road that led to her property. The HOA had been nothing more than a small group of neighbors who met monthly to discuss shared concerns about road maintenance and snow removal. Sarah had declined to join, not out of antisocial sentiment, but because she valued her independence and didn't want to be bound by someone else's rules about what color she could paint her shutters or what flowers she could plant in her garden. "You see," Pemberton continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction, "our community has standards, property values to maintain, aesthetics to preserve. Your, shall we say, eclectic approach to property management has become quite the eyesore." Sarah's gaze swept across her yard, taking in the wildflower meadow she'd cultivated. The organic vegetable garden that fed her year-round, and the solar panels that had made her home energy independent before it was fashionable. To her, it was beautiful in its natural state. To the HOA, it was chaos that needed to be controlled. "So this is about my dandelions and my weather-beaten fence?" she asked. "This is about community standards, Ms. Chen, about being a team player, about contributing to the greater good instead of selfishly pursuing your own agenda, and if I refuse, then you'll discover just how inconvenient life can become when you're cut off from the rest of the world. No postal service, no delivery trucks, no emergency services. After all, they can't very well drive through private property without permission, can they?" The line went dead. Sarah stood at her window for a long moment, watching the HOA members congratulate themselves on their morning's work. She thought about her late father, who'd fought in Korea and always told her that bullies only understood one language. She thought about her ex-husband, who'd tried to control every aspect of her life until she'd finally found the courage to leave. She thought about her career as a civil engineer, the bridges she'd built, the roads she'd designed, the infrastructure projects that had shaped 3 counties. Most importantly, she thought about the secret she'd buried in these hills. Years ago, her phone buzzed with a text message from her neighbor to the east, old Harry Kowalski, whose property bordered hers but wasn't part of the HOA development. Sarah saw what they did. "This is crazy," called the sheriff, "but he says it's a civil matter. You need help, you call me." At least she had one ally. Sarah walked to her home office, a converted bedroom lined with filing cabinets and engineering drawings. She pulled out a thick folder marked Property Surveys Willowbrook Heights and spread the contents across her desk. Maps, blueprints, geological surveys, and legal documents dating back to 1987 covered every surface. She'd been the lead engineer on the original road project that had opened this area for development, before Pemberton and his cronies had ever heard of Willowbrook Heights. Sarah had been here designing the infrastructure that would support their dream community. She'd surveyed every inch of land, mapped every underground utility line, and calculated every grade and drainage angle. And she'd discovered something that the developers had never bothered to investigate. Her fingers traced the original survey map following the path of Maple Ridge Road from the county highway to her property. The road had been built on what appeared to be a straightforward right-of-way, but Sarah's detailed geological surveys had revealed something far more complex. The entire section of road that the HOA had just blocked sat on an easement that predated all other claims by nearly a century, an easement that had been granted in 1923 to ensure access to what was then a working farm. An easement that had never been legally dissolved, despite decades of property transfers and development. More importantly, the easement wasn't just for vehicle access. It included utility rights that were still in active use. Sarah picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. "Marcus, it's Sarah Chen. I need a favor." Marcus Rodriguez had been her protege when she'd worked for the county engineering department. Now he ran his own surveying firm and had access to records that most people didn't even know existed. "Sarah, how's retirement treating you? Apparently, it's about to get interesting. I need you to pull the original easement documents for Maple Ridge Road, the ones from 1923. That's going back pretty far. What's this about? The HOA just blocked my road. They claim it's private property now." Marcus let out a low whistle. "Those idiots. Don't they know you designed half the infrastructure in this county? Give me 2 hours. I'll have everything you need." After hanging up, Sarah made herself a second cup of coffee and returned to her window. The HOA members were still clustered around their barricade, admiring their handiwork. Margaret Foster was taking photos, probably for their newsletter. Dr. Webb was on his phone, likely calling his golf buddies to brag about putting the troublesome neighbor in her place. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. Sarah's phone rang again. This time it was her mail carrier, Pete Dominguez, who'd been delivering to her address for 15 years. "Ms. Chen, I'm here at the barricade, but I can't get through. The HOA president says I need special permission to access your property. Something about private roads and insurance liability. Don't worry about it, Pete. I'm expecting some important documents today. Can you meet me at the county highway? Where the road starts? Sure thing. But what's all this about?" This dawn broke gray and cold over Willowbrook Heights, the kind of morning that made everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. Sarah stood in her kitchen, watching the steam rise from her coffee as she mentally rehearsed the day ahead. At 6:30 a.m., she was already fully dressed in work boots, jeans, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. Today wasn't about looking presentable for the neighbors. Today was about digging up the truth. Harry Kowalski arrived at 7 sharp, his ancient pickup truck rumbling to a stop in her driveway. The metal detector case rattled in his truck bed alongside shovels, a pickaxe, and what looked like half the contents of his garage. "Morning, Sarah," he called out, his breath visible. In the cold air, brought everything I could think of. "What exactly are we looking for?" Sarah walked outside, her boots crunching on frost-covered grass. "Something that's going to change everything, Harry. I just need to find the exact location." She pulled out the 1987 Geological Survey, the pages crackling in the cold air. Her finger traced a line across the map, following the path of the main water line from the county connection point to where it branched off to serve the various streets of Willowbrook Heights. "Right here," she said, pointing to a spot about 50 feet from the barricade. "This is where they installed the main shutoff valve. It should be about 4 feet down in a concrete housing." Harry squinted at the survey. "That's county property, isn't it? If it's a water main, that's exactly the point. The county has permanent easement rights to access and maintain that line, which means," she gestured toward the concrete barriers, "all of this is illegal. They've blocked access to critical infrastructure." As if summoned by her words, a black sedan pulled up to the barricade. Richard Pemberton emerged, his usual smugness replaced by something that looked almost like concern. He wasn't alone. Margaret Foster climbed out of the passenger seat, followed by Dr. Webb from the back. "What are you doing, Miss Chen?" Pemberton called out, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she switched on the metal detector and began sweeping it across the ground in methodical patterns. The device remained silent for several minutes, then suddenly erupted in a rapid series of beeps. "Got it," she said to Harry. "Start digging. You can't dig there. That's HOA property." "No, Richard," Sarah called back without stopping her work. "That's county easement. Check your surveys." The truth was, Sarah knew Pemberton had never bothered to check the surveys. They'd assumed that because their development was newer and more expensive, it somehow took precedence over everything that had come before. It was the kind of arrogance that made her teeth ache. Harry's shovel bit into the earth with satisfying chunks. The old man was stronger than he looked, and within minutes, "Sarah," a new voice called out. Marcus Rodriguez was walking up her driveway, a briefcase in one hand and a tablet in the other. "Perfect timing. I've got news." "What kind of news?" "I spent half the night digging through county records. That easement isn't just active, it's been violated about 15 different ways. The county's been looking for an excuse to revoke the development's permits for years." Pemberton must have heard Marcus's words, because he was now on his phone, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Margaret Foster looked like she was about to be sick, and Dr. Webb was frantically scrolling through his own phone. "Keep digging," Sarah told Harry. "I want to see their faces when we hit that valve housing." 20 minutes later, Harry's shovel struck concrete with a satisfying thunk. They'd found it a square concrete housing about 3 feet on each side, with a heavy metal lid marked County Water Authorized Personnel Only. "Beautiful," Sarah breathed. She pulled out her phone and took several photos, making sure to capture the county markings clearly. Then she called the number she'd memorized the night before. "County Water Department. This is Sarah Chen. To report a blocked access violation to the main service line on Maple Ridge Road." The response was immediate and exactly what she'd hoped for. Within 30 minutes, a county truck was driving up the long way around, just as Sarah had done the day before. The driver was a young man named Tommy who'd worked with Sarah on several projects before her retirement, Ms. Chen. "What's going on here?" Tommy looked at the barricade with obvious confusion. "How are we supposed to access the line with all this in the way?" "That's exactly the problem, Tommy. They've blocked county access to critical infrastructure. I need you to document everything and call your supervisor." As Tommy began taking photos and measurements, Sarah noticed more vehicles arriving. The HOA board members were gathering like a war council, their expensive cars creating a small traffic jam near the barricade. She could see them gesturing angrily, pointing at her property and the county truck. Sarah spotted the familiar logo of Channel 7 News on the side of a white van pulling up to the scene. Someone had tipped off the media. "Did you call them?" Harry asked, nodding toward the news van. "Not me," Sarah said, but she had a pretty good idea who had. Marcus Rodriguez was known for his connections throughout the county, and he'd always believed that public pressure was the best way to force politicians to do the right thing. The reporter who emerged from the van was Jessica Martinez, a young woman who'd built her reputation on exposing local corruption and bureaucratic overreach. She took one look at the scene, the barricade, the county truck, and the small crowd of angry HOA members. Sarah could practically see her journalistic instincts kicking into high gear. "I'm Jessica Martinez from Channel 7. I understand there's a dispute about road access here." Before Sarah could answer, Pemberton inserted himself into the conversation. "There's no dispute," he said, his politician's smile firmly in place. "This is simply a matter of private property rights. The Willowbrook Heights community has the right to control access to its private roads. But this isn't a private road, is it?" Jessica had done her homework. According to county records, this is a public easement that provides access to critical infrastructure. Pemberton's smile flickered. "I'm not sure where you're getting your information." And from the original survey documents filed in 1987, documents that show this road was built on a permanent easement that includes utility access rights. Sarah felt a surge of admiration for the young reporter. She'd not only done her research, but had clearly coordinated with Marcus to get the full story. "Ms. Chen," Jessica turned to Sarah, "you were the lead engineer on the original road project, weren't you? What's your perspective on this situation?" Sarah looked at the camera, then at the crowd of HOA members who were now openly panicking. Margaret Foster was on her phone, probably calling her lawyer. Dr. Webb was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. And Pemberton was starting to look like a man who'd just realized he'd bet everything on a hand of cards, never actually looked at. "My perspective," Sarah said clearly, "is that some people forgot the most basic rule of development. You can't build on land you don't own, and you can't block access to infrastructure that doesn't belong to you." "But surely there was some kind of agreement or understanding," Pemberton began. "There was an understanding," Sarah cut him off. "The understanding was that the county would maintain permanent access to its infrastructure, regardless of what got built around it. That understanding was legally documented and filed with the county clerk's office 23 years ago. Tommy, the county worker, chose that moment to approach with his clipboard. "Ms. Chen, I've got my supervisor on the phone. He says we need immediate access to the main line. There's been a pressure drop in the system, and we need to check the valve housing." Sarah's smile was sharp as winter wind. Of course there's a pressure drop. The implications hit Pemberton like a physical blow. If the county's water main was damaged, the liability would be enormous. And if it was damaged because of the HOA's illegal barricade, "Tommy," Sarah said, "I think you're going to need to remove these barriers to access the county infrastructure. For emergency maintenance, of course." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Tommy replied. He walked over to his truck and began unloading a portable concrete saw. "Wait," Pemberton's composure finally cracked. "You can't just destroy private property." "It's not private property," Jessica Martinez said, her camera operator capturing every word. "It's a public easement. The county has the right to remove any obstruction that prevents access to critical infrastructure." Sarah watched the scene unfold with the satisfaction of an engineer seeing a perfectly calculated solution come together. The HOA members were huddled in urgent conversation, their phones buzzing with calls from lawyers and insurance companies. The county truck was positioning itself to begin removing the barriers, and the news camera was capturing every moment of their humiliation. But the real revelation was still to come. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Check your email." The first sign of retaliation came at 3:17 a.m. When Sarah's security lights triggered and flooded her front yard with harsh white light, she was awake instantly. The engineer's instincts that had kept her safe on construction sites for 30 years kicking in before her conscious mind fully engaged. Through her bedroom window, she could see a figure moving near her electrical meter, not attempting to hide, but not announcing themselves either. Sarah reached for the baseball bat, started keeping beside her bed, and moved silently through her house. By the time she reached the front door, the figure was gone. But the message was clear. They knew where she lived, and they weren't afraid to get close. Sarah stepped outside, her bare feet cold against the concrete porch. Her electrical meter had been tampered with, not damaged, but definitely manipulated. Someone had tried to shut off her power, but the attempt had been clumsy, amateurish. The kind of thing someone might try if they'd watched a YouTube video, but had never actually worked with electrical systems. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Drop the lawsuit or face the consequences. Sarah deleted the text and went back inside. If they thought intimidation tactics would work on someone who'd spent her career dealing with construction, site bullies, and corrupt contractors, they were about to learn how wrong they could be. The next morning brought a parade of official vehicles to Willowbrook Heights. County inspectors, utility workers, and what appeared to be a team of environmental specialists converged on the development like an occupying army. Sarah watched from her kitchen window, sipping coffee and feeling a deep satisfaction as she counted the violations being documented. Her phone rang at 8 sharp. Marcus Rodriguez sounded like he'd been up all night. "Sarah, you need to see the morning news." She turned on Channel 7 just in time to catch Jessica Martinez's follow-up report. The story had exploded overnight, picked up by regional news outlets and social media. The footage of the barriers being destroyed had gone viral, with the hashtag HOA bullies trending across 3 states. But more importantly, the story had caught the attention of the state attorney general's office. According to Jessica's report, they were launching an investigation into potential corruption in the county permitting process. How had the HOA managed to get the road reclassified as private property without proper notification or public hearings? Sarah's satisfaction was interrupted by the sound of vehicles in her driveway. Through the window, she could see 3 black SUVs parked outside her house. Men in expensive suits were getting out, moving with the measured precision of people accustomed to being in charge. Richard Pemberton emerged from the lead vehicle, but he wasn't alone. The man beside him was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the kind of authority that usually came with either significant wealth or significant political power. Sarah recognized him from newspaper photos. William Hartwell, the county's most powerful developer and a major contributor to political campaigns across the region. Behind them came 2 men who were obviously lawyers, their briefcases and serious expressions marking them as clearly as uniforms. Sarah opened her front door before they could knock. "Gentlemen, I assume this isn't a social call." Hartwell stepped forward, his smile as cold as January wind. "Miss Chen, I'm William Hartwell. I believe we need to have a conversation." "I can't imagine what we'd have to talk about, Mr. Hartwell." "I think you can. You've caused quite a stir with your little publicity stunt yesterday. Some very important people are very unhappy." Sarah stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. "By all means, come in. I'd hate for the neighbors to miss the show." They settled in her living room like predators claiming territory. Hartwell took the chair closest to the window, positioning himself so that the morning light would be behind him when Sarah sat down. It was a classic intimidation technique, and Sarah recognized it immediately. She chose to remain standing. "Let me be direct," Miss Chen, Hartwell began. "You've stumbled into something much larger than a simple neighborhood dispute. The Willowbrook Heights development is part of a comprehensive regional growth plan that represents hundreds of millions of dollars in investment." "Interesting. And this relates to my blocked road. How?" One of the lawyers spoke up. "Your actions yesterday have triggered a cascade of regulatory reviews that could delay or derail several major projects. Projects that employ thousands of people and generate significant tax revenue for the county." Sarah felt a cold smile touch her lips. "So, this is about money. How refreshing. Usually, people dress it up as being about community standards or property values. This is about responsible development," Pemberton interjected, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "About balancing individual selfishness against the greater good." "The greater good." Sarah's voice went dangerous. "You mean the greater good that includes bribing county officials to reclassify public roads? The greater good that includes building on county property without permits? The greater good that includes blocking access to critical infrastructure?" Hartwell raised a hand, silencing Pemberton. Ms. Chen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The road reclassification was entirely legal, processed through proper channels with full documentation. Funny thing about documentation, Sarah said. I've seen the files. The original application was submitted by someone, claiming to represent all property owners on Maple Ridge Road, but I never signed anything. In fact, I was never even notified. The second lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Sarah had clearly hit a nerve. That's a minor procedural issue, Hartwell said smoothly, easily corrected. What I'm here to discuss is a solution that benefits everyone. He nodded to one of the lawyers, who opened his briefcase and extracted a thick document. We're prepared to offer you a very generous settlement, $1.5 million for your property, plus relocation assistance and legal fees. It's well above market value. Sarah looked at the document, but didn't take it. Let me guess. In exchange for dropping all claims and agreeing to a non-disclosure agreement. It's a fair offer, Hartwell said. More than fair. You could buy a much nicer property anywhere in the county. And what happens to the easement, the water main, the $300,000 in county fines? Those are administrative matters that can be resolved through proper channels. The important thing is finding a solution that allows the community to move forward. Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the county workers still documenting violations throughout the development. You know what I find interesting, Mr. Hartwell? I've been an engineer for over 30 years. I've worked on projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And in all that time, I've never seen anyone offer to pay premium prices for a problem, unless they were desperately afraid of what would happen if they didn't. She turned back to face them. So what aren't you telling me? What's really at stake here? The silence stretched until Pemberton finally cracked. The State Environmental Review. If they dig too deep into the permit process, they'll discover Richard, shut up, Hartwell snapped. But it was too late. Sarah's mind was already racing, connecting dots that she hadn't even known existed. Environmental review, permit process, hundreds of millions of dollars. The wetlands, she said softly. You built on protected wetlands? Hartwell's face went stone cold. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. The creek that runs through my property doesn't stop at the property line. It continues through the entire development, doesn't it? Or it did before you diverted it. Before you filled in the wetlands and built houses on top of them. Sarah could see the truth in their faces. The expensive suits couldn't hide the fear in their eyes. The federal EPA hasn't figured it out yet, she continued, but they will, especially now that there's a spotlight on every permit and every approval. When they start looking at satellite photos from before construction began, when they start testing soil samples, you don't understand the economic implications. One of the lawyers said desperately, if the development is found to be in violation of federal environmental law, the remediation costs alone could bankrupt the county. Hundreds of families could lose their homes. Maybe you should have thought of that before you decided to build. On protected wetlands, Hartwell stood abruptly. This conversation is over. But let me be very clear, Ms. Chen. You're playing a game you don't understand with people who have resources you can't imagine. The offer I've made today is generous. It may not be repeated. Is that a threat, Mr. Hartwell? It's a business proposition, nothing more. They filed out of her house like a funeral procession, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken menace. Sarah watched them drive away, her mind churning with the implications of what she'd learned. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. Rodriguez, Marcus, I need you to pull every environmental impact study ever filed for the Willowbrook Heights development. I also need you to get me satellite photos of this area from 1995 to 2000. What are you looking for? Evidence of the biggest environmental crime in county history. Her next call was to Jessica Martinez. Jessica, it's Sarah Chen. Remember when you asked if there was more to this story? Well, you haven't seen anything yet. Within an hour. Marcus had emailed her the environmental studies, or rather, the EPA arrived on a Thursday morning in a convoy of white government vehicles that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as federal agents in hazmat suits began setting up equipment throughout the Willowbrook Heights development, their Geiger counters and soil sampling kits, turning the manicured neighborhood into what resembled a crime scene, which Sarah reflected it essentially was. It had been 2 weeks since her confrontation with William Hartwell. 2 weeks of escalating media attention and increasingly desperate attempts by the HOA to contain the damage. But the truth, once released, had proven impossible to recapture. The breaking point had come when Jessica Martinez's investigative team uncovered the paper trail linking Hartwell's development company to a web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. The same day, the state attorney general's office had announced criminal charges against 3 county officials for accepting bribes in exchange for permit approvals. But the EPA's arrival meant the stakes had just climbed to a whole new level. Sarah's phone rang, and she wasn't surprised to see Marcus Rodriguez's number on the screen. "Are you watching this?" he asked without preamble. "Front row seat. How bad do you think it is?" "Bad enough that they're wearing hazmat suits." "I've been monitoring the radio chatter there, finding contamination levels that are off the charts." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning air. What kind of contamination? Industrial runoff, heavy metals, chemical residue. Apparently, before this area was developed, it was used as an illegal dumping ground for manufacturing waste. The wetlands weren't just destroyed, they were poisoned. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Hundreds of families were living on contaminated soil, drinking water that flowed through poisoned ground, breathing air that carried toxic particles. The environmental crime was even worse than she'd imagined. "Marcus, I need you to do something. For me, I need you to pull the health records for Willowbrook Heights residents over the past 20 years. Cancer rates, birth defects, respiratory illness, anything that might be connected to environmental exposure. That's going to take some serious legal maneuvering. Then we better get started." As Sarah hung up, she noticed a familiar black SUV pulling up to the EPA command center that had been established in the development's community center parking lot. William Hartwell emerged, flanked by what appeared to be an army of lawyers, all of them moving with the urgent desperation of people who knew their world was collapsing. But it was the figure who got out of the second SUV that made Sarah's blood run cold. Richard Pemberton wasn't wearing his usual expensive suit. Instead, he was dressed in work clothes and carrying what looked like a large duffel bag. As Sarah watched, he began walking not toward the EPA command center, but toward her property. Sarah grabbed her phone and speed-dialed Harry Kowalski. "Harry, I need you to get over here right now and bring that shotgun you keep talking about." "What's wrong?" "I think Pemberton's about to do something very stupid." Sarah was watching through her window when Pemberton reached her front yard. He set down the duffel bag and unzipped it, revealing what appeared to be several containers of gasoline and a road flare. The message was unmistakable. If he couldn't silence her through intimidation or bribery, he'd settle for destroying her. And everything she represented, Sarah was already moving toward her back door when Pemberton lit the flare. She had maybe 30 seconds before he started spreading gasoline around her house, maybe a minute before the whole place went up in flames. But Sarah Chen hadn't survived 30 years in construction by panicking under pressure. She grabbed the garden hose from her back porch and turned the water on full blast. Then she picked up her phone and called 911. "This is Sarah Chen at 1247 Maple Ridge Road. I have a man with gasoline and an ignition source threatening to burn down my house. I need fire and police immediately." As she spoke, she was moving around the side of her house, using the building as cover while she approached Pemberton from behind. The man was so focused on his arson preparations that he didn't notice her until she was close enough to spray him with the garden hose. "What the hell?" Pemberton spun around, the lit flare still in his hand. "Drop it, Richard," Sarah said, keeping the water pressure aimed directly at him. "Drop the flare and step away from the gasoline." "You've destroyed everything," Pemberton screamed, his face contorted with rage. 20 years of work, hundreds of millions of dollars, thousands of jobs all destroyed because you couldn't. Mind your own business. I didn't destroy anything. I just refused to let you bury the truth." "The truth," Pemberton laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The truth is that you're a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see other people succeed. The truth is that you've condemned hundreds of families to lose their homes, their investments, their futures. The truth is that those families were poisoned," Sarah shot back. "The truth is that you and Hartwell and everyone else involved knew this land was contaminated and you built on it anyway. The truth is that you've been slowly killing people for 20 years and now you're finally going to pay for it." Pemberton's grip on the flare tightened. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." He took a step toward the gasoline containers, but before he could reach them, the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the air. Pemberton stumbled, clutching his shoulder as the flare flew from his hand and landed harmlessly in Sarah's soaked front yard. Harry Kowalski emerged from behind Sarah's truck, his hunting rifle still trained on Pemberton. That was a warning. "Shot, you crazy bastard. The next one won't be within minutes." The area was swarming with police, firefighters, and EPA agents. Pemberton was taken away in handcuffs, his shoulder wound treated by paramedics who seemed less than sympathetic to a man who'd just attempted arson. But the real drama was just beginning. As Sarah watched EPA team leader Dr. Elizabeth Warren approach the media crowd that had gathered at the scene, her face was grim as she addressed the cameras. "Based on our preliminary findings, we are recommending the immediate evacuation of all residents in the Willowbrook Heights development. Soil contamination levels exceed federal safety standards by factors of 10 to 100. This area poses an immediate health risk to anyone living here." The reaction from the gathered HOA members was immediate and devastating. Margaret Foster collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Dr. Webb stood frozen in shock, staring at his house as if seeing it for the first time. Other residents began emerging from their homes, many carrying hastily packed suitcases as they realized their perfect neighborhood had become uninhabitable. Jessica Martinez pushed through the crowd to reach Sarah. "Ms. Chen, what's your reaction to today's development?" Sarah looked at the chaos around her. The EPA teams in hazmat suits, the evacuating families, the smoking remains of what had once been Willowbrook Heights' perfect facade. "My reaction," she said slowly, "is that the truth always finds a way to surface. You can bury it under concrete and lies and legal maneuvering, but eventually it comes back up. And when it does, the reckoning is always worse than if you'd just faced it honestly from the beginning." What happens now? Now the real work begins. Those families are going to need medical monitoring, relocation assistance, and compensation. For what's been done to them, the people responsible are going to face justice. And this land, she gestured toward the contaminated development, this land is going to need healing. As the news crews packed up their equipment and the last of the residents drove away from their poisoned paradise, Sarah stood in her yard and surveyed the devastation. Her house was safe, her road was clear, and the bullies who tried to intimidate her were facing federal charges. But she took no joy in the victory. Too many innocent people had been hurt. Too many families had been living unknowingly in danger. For too many years, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Health records are in cancer rates. In Willowbrook Heights are 400% above county average. Birth defects at 600% above normal. We've got them dead to rights." Sarah looked at her phone for a long moment, then at the EPA team still working to document the contamination. The legal battles would go on for years. The cleanup would take decades. The victims would need advocacy and support for the rest of their lives. She was 73 years old. She'd earned her retirement, earned the right to tend her garden and read her books and live quietly. But sometimes, she reflected, the most important construction project was building a foundation for justice. And that was work that never really ended. Sarah Chen walked back into her house, sat down at her computer, and began typing the first draft of what would become the largest environmental lawsuit in the county's history. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the same spot where the concrete barricade had once blocked her road. But the world around her had been transformed beyond recognition. Where Willowbrook Heights had once sprawled in manicured perfection, environmental remediation project now stretched to the horizon. Heavy machinery worked around the clock, carefully removing contaminated soil and replacing it with clean earth, while a new wetlands restoration project brought life back to the poisoned creek that ran through her property. The November morning was crisp and clear, and Sarah could see her breath as she walked the perimeter of what had once been the most exclusive neighborhood in the county. To what happened when greed and corruption collided with the immutable laws of environmental justice. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Rodriguez. "Jury's back. Hartwell verdict in 20 minutes." The media circus that had once followed her every move had largely moved on to other stories. But a dedicated group of reporters still covered the trials that had been grinding through the legal system for nearly 2 years. The courthouse steps were crowded with familiar faces. Harry Kowalski waved at her from near the entrance, his arm still in a sling from the shoulder surgery he'd needed after decades of construction work. And scattered throughout the crowd were dozens of former Willowbrook Heights residents. Inside the courthouse, Sarah took her usual seat in the gallery. The past 2 years had made her intimately familiar with this courtroom, as she'd testified in case after case against the network of corruption that had enabled the environmental catastrophe. William Hartwell sat at the defendant's table, looking far older than his 68 years. Beside him, his team of expensive lawyers looked defeated, their briefcases packed with legal strategies that had all proven inadequate against the mountain of evidence Sarah and Marcus had assembled. Richard Pemberton wouldn't be joining them for the verdict. He'd died in federal prison 6 months earlier, in his death-only sadness for another life destroyed by the web of lies and corruption. Sarah had testified before Judge Hendricks many times over the past 2 years, and she'd come to respect the older woman's unwavering commitment to justice, even when that justice was complicated and painful. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Hendricks asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man who'd reminded Sarah of her father throughout the trial, stood up. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to violate federal environmental law, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of racketeering in connection with illegal waste disposal, a litany of guilty verdicts that covered everything from bribery to fraud to criminal negligence, resulting in death." With each word, Sarah watched William Hartwell's shoulders slump further, until he looked like a man who had finally accepted the weight of his crimes. When it was over, Hartwell was led away in handcuffs to begin what would likely be the rest of his life in federal prison. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the former residents, many of whom were crying as they finally saw justice for the man who had poisoned their families. Outside the courthouse, Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters asking for her reaction to the verdict, but before she could speak, a small voice called out from the crowd, "Ms. Chen." Sarah turned to see 8-year-old Emma Foster running toward her, followed by her mother Margaret. The little girl had been born with severe birth defects that doctors now linked directly to her mother's exposure to contaminated groundwater during pregnancy. Emma would need medical care for the rest of her life, but the settlement fund that Sarah had helped establish would ensure she got everything she needed. "Ms. Chen, look." Emma held up a drawing she'd made, a picture of a house surrounded by flowers and trees, with a smiling sun overhead. "It's my new house. Mommy says we're going to have a garden just like yours, and tomatoes, and maybe some of those yellow flowers you have that the bees like." "Dandelions," Sarah said softly. "Ms. Chen, I owe you an apology. All those years, we thought you were the problem. We thought you were the one who didn't belong. But you were the only one who was honest." Sarah stood up and embraced the woman who had once been her enemy. "We all did what we thought was right with the information we had. The important thing is that Emma and all the other children are going to be safe now." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah walked back to her truck. The drive home took her past the remediation site, where she could see the progress that had been made in cleaning up the contamination. Had been in over a century. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. It was Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the EPA. "Sarah, I wanted to give you the good news personally. The water quality tests came back clean. Your well is officially safe to drink from again." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for 2 years. "That's the best news I've heard in a long time. There's something else. Let's call it your unique perspective on environmental justice." Sarah looked out her kitchen window at her garden, where the wildflowers were dormant for the winter but would bloom again in the spring. At 75, she'd earned the right to tend her garden and enjoy her retirement. That needed to be exposed. Other families who needed someone to fight for them. "I'll think about it," she told Dr. Warren. "But I have some conditions. Name them." "For affected families," and ... double quotes, Sarah smiled. "I want the right to work from home. I've gotten attached to my kitchen window." That evening, as Sarah sat in her living room reviewing the final settlement documents from the last of the civil cases, association, a determination to maintain her independence in the face of neighborhood pressure. It had ended with the largest environmental cleanup in state history and justice for hundreds of families who had been poisoned by corporate greed. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Harry Kowalski stood on her porch, holding a bottle of champagne and grinning from ear to ear. "Thought we should celebrate," he said. "It's not every day you bring down $1 billion conspiracy." Sarah invited him in, and they sat in her kitchen. The remediation site stretched out before them, but Sarah could see past the heavy machinery to what this place would become: a restored wetland where wildlife could thrive. "You know what the best part is?" Harry asked, raising his glass in a toast. "What's that? Your dandelions are still here." Intended. Sarah clinked her glass against his and smiled. "2 dandelions," she said, "and to the truth that always finds a way to grow, no matter how hard people try to bury it." Outside her window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. She had built a foundation for justice, a precedent for environmental protection, and a legacy that would protect families for generations to come. Instead, she had forced the world to face the imperfect truth. The difference: